see this dark shadow like. I heard my dad say, it's on fire, it's gonna crash.
My sister suffered from the effects of smoke and fume inhalation and died several months later.
His mother never got over it, never ever got over it.
Even now, after 70 odd years, I still get flashbacks. I get dreams at night sometimes, and I'm still flying over.
The heavy conversion units were really not a good place to be. The safety rate in the heavy conversion unit was twice as bad as it was on operations.
Immediately after the crash, she and her sisters had to smash a door down, and she walked over the burning wing of the plane.
We're all tied together because of this tragedy.
Well, my name's Andy Tagger. I live in Darrington, have lived in Darrington with my wife since 1983. Currently a Darrington Parish Councillor, and although I wasn't brought up in Darrington, I was born and raised in Leeds. Darrington now is my adopted village and love the place. Well, Darrington, it's a village in West Yorkshire. It's just on the outskirts of Pontefract and just north of Doncaster as well. We've got a pub, a couple of hotels, a golf club, a couple of farms, a good village shop, lots of lovely people. It's a very friendly village, sort of place where you can walk down the street and people will say hello to you. Well, Darrington was relatively unaffected by the war. It wasn't the sort of place that was at the centre of all the activity. There were quite a number of RAF bases around, but Darrington itself was just getting on with its life, carrying on in a way that, in spite of all this, they were making the best of. It was just a sleepy sort of rural village. However, the village was suddenly affected by a Halifax bomber crashing into a row of houses on Valley Road, causing devastation and destruction.
My name's Dave Epworth. I first heard about the Darrington crash from Father Garrod, who was the vicar at Badworth Church, and previously to that he was the vicar of Womersley Church, which is the next village along to Darrington. I fired an email off in 2016 to Darrington Parish Council because basically I thought it might be nice if there could be a plaque erected at the crash site to commemorate all the crew and the civilians that were lost.
There'd been a book produced that had detailed one or two bits and pieces about the air crash, but nothing in any particular special detail. And we certainly hadn't clocked the fact that it was going to be a 75th anniversary.
When I mentioned the fact that it was the 75th anniversary coming up, the council seemed to rally round that fact, and there was total support.
We're a parish council, we're not a big town council, we're not a district council, we're a parish council, we're all about community. And the fact that something so significant had happened in our village in 1943, and it was the 75th anniversary coming up, I felt it was so important that the village, the parish council, must mark that moment.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are unveiling a commemorative sign here on Chapel Hill. I am one member of a volunteer project team that has thoroughly enjoyed the challenge of raising awareness of probably one of the most awful events in the history of Darrington. For almost 2 years, I, along with Dennis Burns, Judith Fisher, Gail Jenkins, Jeff Pickering and Dave Hepworth, we have sought to contact surviving family members of the 6 aircrew and 6 residents who died. We are pleased and relieved to record our appreciation of the support given by Darrington Parish Council that has enabled us to plan for today.
So one of our team set up a Facebook site. We used that to make contact with as many different people as possible. The more information that came onto the site, the more we seemed to develop and make the contact, so that on the day, on the Memorial Day, we were able to welcome representatives of many of the services and surviving members of families. The afternoon was devoted to a lunch, and around the hall were many artefacts and exhibits and documents that we'd collected along the way. We also had a number of members of the Dean family attending. It was a very special time for the Dean family to be here in Darrington on the 75th anniversary of the tragic event.
So I'm Mike Dawson. I'm the grandson of Harry and Mabel Dean. Harry and Mabel had 9 children, and my mother was one of those 9 children. My grandfather was a partner in Dean and Frobisher, which was a woodyard and wheelwrights here in the village. It was a firm that was set up by his father. He was very much involved in the local community and in the church. He was choir master, and he was in the church choir for 50 to 60 years, and all the family was involved in activities within the village.
My name is Una Bridson. I was born in 1955 and I live in Western Australia in the foothills just outside Perth. My mother was Nona Dean and she was brought up in Darrington. My mother Nona was the youngest of the 9 children. The family, from my understanding from what Mum has said, it was a very close-knit family. She'd talk about the routine in the house, like Monday was washing day and Tuesday was bread baking day, and the course of all the activities. They also used to go to church together, and my mum tells stories of the family going to church, sometimes on 2 occasions in the course of one day. My mum was a very intellectual person. She went to London University and studied 2 degrees at the same time. So she was really perhaps a woman ahead of her time.
Well, my name is Thomas Dean, and my father, Godfrey Dean, was a son of Mabel and Harry Dean. Now, my dad left England when he was 17 and immigrated into Canada and never went back. And so he wasn't present. He was in Canada when the crash occurred. I gather that my grandfather was fairly strict. As far as home life, it sounded like it was relatively good and people got along, and like any family, right? That sort of thing. Yeah.
Darrington was in the centre, really, of a hive of activity during the war years. It was a rural setting, and yet all around Darrington in Yorkshire there were about 40 other air bases. RAF Rickle was one of those bases. It was a heavy conversion unit which was training up aircrew from medium bombers to the heavy bombers, and was the base from which the Halifax bomber took off.
My name is Ian Fisher, and I am the nephew of David Bealey, one of the crew members. He was the bomb aimer on board. I'm told he was a very nice young fella, good living young man, churchgoer, heavily involved with youth club and swimming and cricket and that sort of stuff. Very bright spark as well, with hopes of being a solicitor one day. I remember going to town with Mother and coming home. David was sat on our back doorstep and he was carving an aeroplane propeller with his penknife out of a bit of wood for my oldest brother, who was sat at the side of him on the doorstep. He'd stay the day and have his tea and then tootle off back. He joined the RAF in 1939 and of course he volunteered for aircrew. He went to Canada to do his initial training, and then from Canada to Lossiemouth in Scotland, and then to Cumbria somewhere. The final leg of his training would be at Rickle in Yorkshire.
Officers' Mess, Royal Air Force, Millom, Cumberland. Sunday the 30th of May, 1943. My dear Edgar, I guess you must have thought I had ceased to exist, not hearing from me for such a length of time. But as you may know, I remustered to aircrew last July, and I've been pretty well absorbed in it since then, and have let my letter writing slide very badly. How did you like your smack at the Bosch? I hope to have a crack at them myself in 2 months' time. I hope to get quite a kick out of dropping 4,000 and 8,000 pound bombs on the baskets. As you can see from the address, I am now a pilot officer for the duration of the war. I am hoping to go on Lancasters, which are Whizzo kites. I am leaving tomorrow and I'm either going up to the north of Scotland or down south in Yorkshire, but I'm not quite sure yet. I shall be at the new station some 8 weeks. A little gal in Rotherham named Joy Pearson wants me to become hitched to her wagon, but I'm thinking of saying no dice, as I guess my future isn't as secure as it used to be. I'd hate to make her a very young widow. I think I'll stick with the boys until I've finished my first operational tour. All the best in health and spirits, and good luck, old scout. Dave.
RAF Rickle is long gone. It's closed down in 1957. Vegetation and all sorts of things have grown around there. There's very little left.
It was opened, I think, in about 1942 as a heavy conversion unit. It was specifically for training 4-engine bomber crew. It was a 6 weeks course at Rickall, mainly cross-country, doing navigational exercises, bombing exercises as well. And from there, after 6 weeks, you would be sent onto a squadron and then over to Germany and be fodder for the Germans to shoot at. Obviously, officers didn't mix with the sergeants. I think once the crews landed, sergeants went to the sergeants' mess and officers went to the officers' mess, and they lived completely different lives. It was still very much a class society, wasn't it, in those days?
The way the crews were chosen is interesting. They were all pushed into a hangar and told to sort themselves out. This is actually brilliant because you can't blame the management. It is your fault entirely if it doesn't work.
My uncle David Bealey was the bomb aimer. Edward Cook was the wireless operator. Edward Wilson, who was 20, was the pilot. Tom Selland was the rear gunner. Trudgington was the navigator. And Roberts was the engineer.
The prototype Halifax first flew on October the 25th, 1939. The production Halifaxes went to squadron in late 1940 and it went on its first operational trip in 1941. Its main role obviously was as a heavy bomber, and as such it could carry, depending on which mark you're talking about, 13,000 pounds weight of bombs. Generally it would be a mixed load of high explosives and incendiaries. The high explosives would blow the roof off, the incendiaries would then set fire to whatever, factories or buildings.
Whilst we were trying to raise awareness of the project, I was invited to go along to talk to the Ackworth Royal British Legion branch. And whilst I was there, I was introduced to a guy called Jeff Towers, who I learnt was Jeff Towers BEM. And he was a surviving rear gunner from the Halifax bombers, and he had done 40 sorties. I was determined at that point, after having met him, that I wanted him to be down and be part of this commemoration, because how fitting to have somebody who actually had survived 40 sorties in almost the self-same bomber that had crashed into Darrington.
I'm Geoffrey Towers. I served in Bomber Command, completed 40 missions over Germany, Holland and France. I managed to shoot down a Messerschmitt 262 over Bochum. The Germans threw everything up with us by the kitchen sinks, I think, that night. But however, we've survived, and I'm still here anyway. My squad was 158 Squadron, near Bridlington, and we lost 859 young men, never came back. Our song used to be, "East to the dead already, east to the next man to die." We used to turn our glasses upside down then, in respect of the lads that never came back. It was a wonderful relationship, really. We were like a band of brothers in those days. Everybody was for each other. We flew together, we went out in the town together. We were wonderful comrades, really. Never in my lifetime will I ever have such wonderful comrades as I had in those days. They were marvellous men, they were really. I mean, I used to be a bit apprehensive. I used to say a little prayer before I got into my turret. Every time I went out, I used to say a little prayer, you know, hoping I'd come back safe. And so did everybody else, I think, really. But there it was. That's what used to happen in those days.
The aircraft which you can see behind me is the Yorkshire Air Museum's Mark III model of the Halifax with the Hercules engines. The aircraft which crashed at Darrington was actually a Mark II Series 1 Special, which was quite an unusual aircraft in that the mid-upper turret had been taken off in an attempt to clean the aircraft up and improve the aerodynamics. The Halifax Marks 1 and 2 with the Merlin engine had a series of problems, some of which were involved with the engine, some with the aerodynamics of the aircraft itself. Whereas everybody else who fitted a Rolls-Royce Merlin accepted Rolls-Royce's engine mount and fairings, Handley Page said, no, we will design our own. And these were troublesome. He used a riveted engine mount instead of a welded one, and too much vibration got through from the engine to the auxiliaries, resulting in a lot of unreliability in the radiators in particular. There was also a problem with the propellers. Because the propellers were very close to the radiators, as the propeller blade passed the radiator, it got an impulse from the radiator and flexed. So with 3 propellers, it was flexing 3 times on each rotation. This set up a very bad vibration, which led to the loss of some propellers.
They used to suffer from tail stall, and I think it was something to do with the tail configuration.
The tailplane, if you notice on the early ones, was a triangular shape, and it could go into a so-called deep rudder stall.
They used to stall very badly and pancake in, you know, just hit the deck.
The aircraft was virtually uncontrollable, so a number of aircraft were lost that way. The heavy conversion units were really not a good place to be. The safety in the heavy conversion unit was twice as bad as it was on operations. The reason for this was that the heavy conversion units were provided with beat-up old aircraft which had done a number of operations. Combining this with brand new pilots with very few hours on, this was a very toxic combination.
Thousands in the training squadrons never made it. There was more accidents in training squadrons than what there was on actual raids over Germany. Did you know that? It's tremendous. Tremendous amount of people got killed.
Sometime during the day on the 18th of September 1943, the crew who operated Halifax BB245 were told that they'd have to go on a nighttime mission, navigational exercise. They were called Operation Bullseye. Aircraft used to simulate flying a proper operational sortie without actually having to fly over enemy/German territory. They were ordered to fly to Land's End and back. During the day, I would have suspected that the pilots and all the crew would have been preparing their aircraft, making sure that the course was plotted. The gunners would have been preparing the guns. The ground crew would have been checking the aircraft. They set off at 7 o'clock in the evening.
My understanding is that there was to be a family get-together. My mother, Nona, came late at night, which meant that she entered the house quite late. She met her father and her brother on her walk from the railway station.
Harry and William were having a couple of drinks at the Darrington Hotel, just about a 5-minute walk away from their house.
So every Saturday, late on at night, we used to walk from Brotherton back into Nottingley. Now coming on that night, it was pitch black because it was all blackout. There were no street lamps, all the houses were all dark, couldn't see nothing.
It was cold and quite calm.
As a consequence to arriving in the house late at night, my mother, Nona, slept downstairs.
We can only imagine how things were going on the training mission. As far as we know, they were 4 hours into the flight and everything had gone well.
By all accounts, the mission was a success, but the aircraft just south of Darrington experienced a major mechanical malfunction.
So at about 11 o'clock, Harry and William would have returned from the pub, the Darrington Hotel. All the Dean family would have been just going through the normal routine as they prepared to go to bed.
The aircraft was on its final approach to Rickle.
So they'd be down at probably 1,500 feet, 2,000 feet, something like that, when the engine went bang. And of course at that kind of height, you're too low to bail out.
There was an explosion and it lost one of the propellers from the port outer engine, with the result that the motor, the engine, was totally unbalanced.
The pilot, Edward Wilson, I don't think he got any more than 30 hours experience on that aircraft, which is nothing as far as flying hours is concerned, but he was losing height rapidly.
The consensus would have been that this aircraft's going down, so lads, adopt crash landing position.
About this spot, we looked up. When we looked over there, could see this dark shadow like, and it just glided across the sky, and it got lower and lower.
As they were flying over, they'd seen the flat land at the back of Chapel Hill. They did desperately try to turn the plane around to return, to go back flying south, to try and reach that flat land and do a crash landing. But by the time they'd done the turn, they were about 20-30 feet from the ground.
They hit an electricity pylon and then ploughed straight into the cottages.
The moment after the crash, there were at least 4 properties demolished and well ablaze. The Dean family house was completely engulfed in flames.
When they hit the pylon, the aircraft itself exploded because there'd be sparks flying in all directions. And one of the wings finished up in front of a row of cottages and the rest just disintegrated.
My mum tells the story of immediately after the crash, she and her sisters had to smash a door down, and she walked over the burning wing of the plane. As a consequence to the plane crashing into the upper part of the house, the people who were actually sleeping downstairs at the time were the ones that survived.
Coincidentally, just at that time, Army Sergeant John Henry Veerkamp was travelling through Darrington with some colleagues and were there immediately to help assist.
I saw a large burst of flame what I judged to be about 1 mile ahead of us in the vicinity of the road on which we were travelling. In the space of about 2 minutes, we reached a place I now know as Chapel Hill, Darrington, and there found that an aeroplane had crashed into a block of cottages on the offside of this road facing Womersley. 3 or 4 of the cottages were then partly demolished, and an aeroplane enveloped in flames was in the midst of the debris. Ammunition in the plane was exploding almost incessantly, and bullets were whizzing in all directions.
Sergeant Veerkamp was shortly later assisted by a couple of policemen who also happened to turn up on the scene.
The first things that the 4 soldiers and the 2 police constables did when they got to the crash scene was to rescue John and Alice Wardle. Their house was completely demolished, and all the rubble, the bricks, the mortar, wood, everything was all around them.
Despite the imminent danger of fire and smoke, my 2 men and the policeman helped to make a further search of the house for possibly trapped persons. We failed to find anyone else and were driven back by fire, bursting flares and smoke. We then formed a bucket chain and fought the flames, but this was useless and the fire got completely out of control and further attempt at rescue would have been futile.
Hiya, Dave.
Hello,
Come on
Andy.
in. Come on in, mate.
Nice to see
Come
you.
on in.
Yeah.
Leave your shoes, you're all right.
Okay.
Come on through.
Thanks.
Okay. Good journey?
Yes, thank you. The traffic was fine, not too busy.
Smashing. Well, it's that sort of time of day,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah. You're
I'll take
keeping
your
well,
coat.
by the way?
I'm keeping fantastic, thank you.
Good.
Let's have your coat.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.
That's good. I brought this so we can have a look at the Facebook maybe
Yeah,
later on.
okay, Andy, that's
okay.
great, yeah.
Got some newspaper articles here.
Right.
I mean, these were done. These articles were produced within days of the horrible accidents, and devastating reading, really.
Yeah.
The headline for this one: plane on cottages. Yeah. Darrington sisters escape down extra staircase.
It's just incredible. It's hard to think of an aircraft that size, a wingspan of over 100 foot, coming into some houses at about at least 150 mile an hour.
And so sad because they're so close to the base.
Yeah, yeah.
So close to home, aren't they? You know,
yeah.
and for the youngsters as well, because they're only young men.
Oh yeah, and inexperienced in flying multi-engined aeroplanes as well.
Right. And it's got a list here. The dead, in addition to the crew of the plane: Harold Dean, 68, sawmiller. His wife, aged 64.
Yeah.
Daughter Ellen and son William. You can see here the map of Chapel Hill where they all lived at the time of the crash.
Yeah, 4 families all living in close proximity to one another. And of course there would have been virtually nothing left after the impact and the resulting fire. Harry Pickering, a sailor, and his wife lost their home but got their 6-day-old baby away safely.
Valerie,
yeah. Yeah.
The father was on special leave and carried his wife in his arms over the fields. But on the time this was published,
the child was still alive.
Yeah, so folk could have been thinking about a disaster in Darrington, but at least the child survived.
Yeah. She died a few months later, didn't she, I believe?
She did.
About 6 months afterwards?
I think so.
I think that was contributed to it was due to the smoke that she must have breathed in.
And then on this other report here, we've got Midgley Pease, who's, according to the newspaper report, taken to the hospital with burns, but again, another one who died.
Yeah. It was totally devastating. I mean, it's probably the most significant and tragic event that's ever happened to Darrington.
I can't think of anything else. We've lived in the village a long, long time, and I can't think of anything else, certainly in the history of Darrington, that really would match up to this.
No, I don't.
It affects me, but I'm not sure whether it really affects other members of the family. I only heard about the extent and the detail of the crash about 20 years ago at my Aunt Una's 90th birthday party. And that was the occasion when we actually saw the newspaper reports of the time and when we learnt all the details, because my mother and her sisters never ever talked about it. It was a very buried part of the history of the family.
Now my dad, I can't remember if he got a telegram or it came in a letter, what had actually happened. It just took time to get the information to him of what happened, and he was extremely shocked. When we did come back, I can't remember if it was 1963 or 1964, there was nothing left, absolutely nothing left. So we were looking for, remnants to take back home.
My mum, I think of all the siblings, actually talked about the crash more than the others. I think one of the outcomes of the horrific incident with the plane crash and the death of a significant portion of Mum's family was the fact that she was quite stoical, and as a consequence to her inner strength, she made that determination to no longer live in the United Kingdom, but to actually move to Australia and establish a new life for herself, in essence a new beginning. She met my father a few years later playing tennis, and they were married in April 1954.
His parents, of course, it affected them greatly, tremendously. Grandfather Bealey, his father, he never did really get over the fact that it was him that was instrumental in making him volunteer for aircrew. And grandmother, she was devastated by it. She never ever did get over it, never. I think she used to visit his grave every week. There was pictures of David everywhere you looked in the house. Be a picture of David. So yes, it affected them greatly, really did.
The actual crash, it's hard to imagine how it must have felt for people living at the time, but certainly as far as we're concerned, people living now, the impact has been huge in many ways. If you can get any good at all out of such a tragic event, the good would be that we have helped to mark a moment. We've helped to make the youngsters of Darrington School aware of something awful that happened in the village, but they've also seen the good that a community can do.
It's a common thread for all of us deans that are gathered here today, which is virtually all of us. Without this, we wouldn't have probably gotten together. You sort of look around and you go like, out of this tragedy, we're together, and look how many of us are around.
Part of me feels very sad about the event and the consequences of the event. However, part of me just thinks this is just a wonderful, wonderful celebration of what the Dean family, what my grandparents actually achieved. Bringing everybody together as a family, I think just revisits those very good values of the past, and it commemorates those members of the Dean family, my grandparents and my auntie and uncle who tragically lost their life.
I'm so pleased that Darrington and the people of Darrington have remembered this such tragic event that happened, and that there is closure on it, and that people now will know forever what happened in this tiny little village all those years ago.
Their memory should be kept alive. I mean, crikey, they gave all for that. They gave their life for the country, and that's what it says on David's gravestone. I've pursued this for many years, so it's great that somebody's putting a permanent memorial up. I think it's brilliant, really.
I thought it was a marvellous tribute to those young men. We should never ever forget them. We should never ever forget people like that.